Welcome everybody to our video lecture, part of the series of lectures on the theme of empire that we're doing this unit. Today we look outside Eurasia to West Africa and the great civilizations that define the imperial history of West Africa. Taking stock of the world during the classical era, we see in strict population terms where most of the people then living actually resided. As your author Robert Strayer shows, of the three supercontinents, that would be Eurasia, Africa, and the Americas combined, of the three supercontinents, Eurasia of the three had the biggest human population during the classical era of world history, but the total world population at the time was less than that of certain modern countries such as the United States today. So the overall population was much smaller than you see, for example, here 51 million total world population during the classical era. Again, the classical era 500 BCE to 500 CE. But nevertheless, a population that was growing and one that was also concentrated most heavily in Eurasia. According to Strayer, quote, classical era civilizations in Africa and the Americas were fewer in number and generally smaller than those of Eurasia, and larger numbers of their people lived in communities that did not feature cities and states. That is, populations residing in Africa and the Americas tended to be less urban. And that, I think, has been the root of certain misconceptions, perhaps rooted in the Western imagination regarding both the Americas and Africa, and has gone a long way toward determining how it is that Westerners in more recent times of history have tended to see African and Native American people. In the United States and in Western Europe, a series of stories, popular stories published in the late 1800s and early 1900s, including stories like Tarzan, Edgar Rice Burroughs' popular Tarzan series, Tarzan of the Apes, tended to imprint certain outlandish notions in the imaginations of Westerners, just as the famous dime novels of the American West, which became popular in America and even Western Europe at the same time, the late 1800s and early 1900s. Dime novels fostered certain stereotypical views of those Native American peoples who lived in the far west of the North American continent. And in both cases, whether the imagination, the imaginary sort of visions, if you will, of Edgar Rice Burroughs or the dime novelist had it seeing African people and Native American people as savage, as uncivilized, as devoid of the sophistication and technology and knowledge of Western and Western European people. And this was during, of course, the age of European imperialism, in which the great European powers more or less treated the peoples of Africa, for example, or even the way the United States more or less treated the peoples of the American West as if they were, in fact, inferior. And so it was this view in the Western imagination of these non-Western peoples that went a long way towards cementing the stereotypes. But in studying world history now, of course, we have to see these stereotypes for what they were, these mythologies for what they were, and to deal, that is to say, really that they said more about Western peoples than they did about the non-Western peoples that they purported to describe. So we have to get past all that. We have to disabuse ourselves of those notions and to see peoples of Africa, for example, in this lecture, and Native America in the next lecture, on their own terms, as people who built, in fact, their own civilizations. And so in this lecture, we look most specifically at West Africa. Why West Africa? Well, when you consider that the African continent spans some 12 million square miles, it, it would be the same as saying that in looking at Eurasia, we should look at the entire Eurasian continent all at once, which of course we haven't done. We've looked at Persia, for example, and we looked at Rome and even China. But with Africa, it's the same. We tend to want to generalize and see all African people as somehow the same, but they weren't the same, and they never saw themselves as being the same. In fact, the word Africa was a word that was applied to them by the Romans, as it turns out. They would not have considered themselves to be African people until much, much later, in fact, in our own time, our own modern era. So dealing with diversity is one of the first things we have to do to get right with Africa. As your author Strayer says, when historians refer to Africa during the classical era, they are speaking generally of a geographic concept, that is, the continental landmass, and not a cultural identity. Certainly no one living on the continent at that time thought of himself or herself as an African, like Eurasia or the Americas. Africa hosted numerous separate societies, cultures, and civilizations with vast differences among them, as well as some interaction between them. And nowhere is our idea first established in the beginning of the semester, the idea of an ecology of civilization, clearer than Africa. That is, when talking of civilizations in history, we always must go back to the fundamental fact of the environment. Distinct environments of Africa include deserts, coastal plains, rainforests, and great savanna grasslands. In other words, Africa is a place of wide-ranging and diverse environments. The Berber peoples of North Africa, for example, who lived along the coastal stretches and the desert boundaries of North Africa, acquired the camel from Arabia and developed a pastoral civilization in the desert regions of the Sahara, that is, applying the technology that went along with the camel, that is, of the Bedouins of Arabia, and adapting it to both the coastal and desert reaches of North Africa. The Berbers thus built their own great civilization based on trade across the Sahara, using the camel as their fundamental conduit. Not an environment typically you would think of as being hospitable to civilization, nevertheless hosted a very vigorous civilization. So, dealing with geography is our first point of order here, and understanding something about the environments of Africa, from what I mentioned just a minute ago, the coastal plains of the Mediterranean, to the desert reaches of the Sahara. This was the region of the Berber people, as I mentioned, the camel caravans that crossed West Africa. The region of sort of north central Africa, that is above the equator, in the area known as the Sudan. These words, by the way, Sahara and Sudan, are not African words, they are Arab words. And as we'll see, the Arabs had also developed important trade connections with the peoples of Africa, much like we saw in the Middle East, where Greek names were applied to non-Greek peoples. It was the Arabs who wrote some of the first histories of Africa, and thus had the privilege, you might say, of naming areas that became popularly accepted. Here we see in the western part of the Sudan a grasslands region, not unlike, say, our own northern plains region, bordered by forests. You have here, then, moving north to south, four very distinct ecosystems, four very diverse environments: coastal plains, Sahara Desert, savanna grasslands, forest, and yet another even would be the coastal southern coastal range of West Africa. And each of these environments then supported diverse cultures, diverse civilizing impulses. It would never be correct to somehow refer to all of them or the people that lived in them as simply African, as if that meant a single identity. Because even within these regions, even within the coastal or forest or savanna grasslands, there existed wide diversity and multicultural identities among the various peoples who never again saw themselves as simply African until much, much later in history when that identity was imposed upon them. The great artery of West Africa in the West African environment was the Niger River. And the ecology of civilization in West Africa owed a lot to its rivers. Just as we've seen in other global areas of the world, whether the rivers of Mesopotamia or the Indus River Valley or China and the Yellow and Yangtze River valleys or Egypt and the Nile Valley, the rivers of West Africa become the hubs of civilization. And it was the Niger River, which you see here from a satellite view, and it's stark where you get this sort of desert borderland to the north, the great Niger River, which flows from west to east, arcing first northward and then southward, where it empties into the Atlantic Ocean near Benin, surrounded on one side by desert, on another by savanna grasslands, and a bit farther to the south by forest and coastal regions. It's the Niger River then that is the grandfather, you might say, of West African civilizations. Here you see a more conventional map showing the regions which the waters of the Niger transverse, again from southwest to north, back to southeast, and meeting the Atlantic Ocean here at Benin, and the great delta, the Niger delta, which will support its own civilization. So very simply, the diverse peoples of West Africa in the ancient period learned to use the Niger for trade, for sustenance, for the life-giving properties that afforded them as agriculturalists and as commercial people. Since Roman times, one of the great commodities that was traded in the Niger region and of course north across the desert to the coastal areas of North Africa, the great commodity, you might say, was salt. And we've seen other great commodities, from bronze and precious minerals to Indian spices to Chinese silks. Since Roman times, it was salt that was traded across the Sahara Desert to the Niger region by the Berber caravans. So you had the Berber peoples, who in complexion, by the way, are a Mediterranean. I call them Mediterranean bronze. They're a lighter, more Mediterranean color, not unlike Italian people. Not to be confused with the darker complected or black-skinned Bantu-speaking peoples south of the Sahara Desert. So bronze and black complexions of different African people meet here in the river regions, including the Niger and the Senegal and other West African rivers, to trade the precious commodities, including the most profitable of them, salt. The salt route began here in the present-day city of Sidi Maza, in what is now sort of the Moroccan, Algerian borderland, passing through the salt-rich villages to the south of the Sahara Desert, and finally to the gold region of the Niger River Basin. Here in this region, gold was mined for many, many centuries and used in exchange and payment for among other things, salt. So the great salt pools of the desert, which yielded the precious commodity. What could salt be used for? Well, among other things, it was a preservative of meat. For example, the peoples of West Africa had great cattle herding traditions and were great eaters of beef, preparers of beef on the flame, and storing that beef in salt, encasing it in salt, was a way of preserving it. Salt could be used in other ways as well that were vital to the cultures of West Africa. What this gives the kingdoms of the Niger River was a chance at a trading empire in West Africa, because they held the key between the salt merchants and the desert caravanners of the north and the peoples of the Niger River region to the south. It was they who held the location advantage, and by 250 BCE, small villages all along the Niger River grew as trade along the Niger River increased. A growing demand for salt led to an exchange of everything from gold and cotton cloth, which was fabricated in West Africa, not to mention various spices that were native to West Africa. All of these were traded with the Berber caravan merchants across the Sahara Desert. After 250 CE, a trading empire in West Africa rose, known as Ghana, and Ghana was the first of the great commercial trading empires centered around the Niger River, and it was ruled by the black-skinned Bantu-speaking African peoples of that area. They arose through an elaborate trade system, as the caption says here, using the Niger River as a highway to transport goods. A large trans-Saharan trade grew, transporting salt to the people of West Africa and gold and other commodities across to the Mediterranean, and from the Mediterranean to Europe, to the Middle East and beyond. So far from being isolated from global history, the great Niger River kingdoms, beginning with Ghana, were integrally related to the trade routes and far-flung trade connections of the Mediterranean Sea, the Indian Ocean, and Eurasia. Kumbi Saleh, a city of some 30,000 people, was the capital of the Ghana trading state. So here we have a rich and rather dense urban environment in West Africa that is situated on the very edge of that trade between the Sahara and the rivers of West Africa. And all the trappings of empire that we would find elsewhere, we find in ancient Ghana, from bureaucracies and civil service to an enduring dynasty of powerful monarchs whose lineage, by the way, was based on matrilineal rather than patrilineal inheritance, that is, through the bloodline of the mother, usually forming a cabinet of ministers, an army said to number upwards of 200,000 soldiers, an effective system for dispensing justice, and a regular source of income through trade and taxation and tribute. And here you see a modern day photo of a tribal leader from Ghana wearing the familiar and colorful patterned textiles, the gold bracelets and other jewelries and adornments which bespoke the status of the great man, the great ruler from the tribes and clans and ultimately states of West Africa. Here we see something that reminds me a bit of the Chinese tomb of horses, although on a miniature scale, wooden hand-carved figures showing the military force of Ghana in miniature, and the ever-familiar gold from West Africa that enticed traders from as far away as Arabia and much later from Europe to tap into the gold trade. Even the ancient Romans traded for West African gold. So a material culture drawn from the land itself, using the materials the environment afforded: cotton textiles, mud, brick dwellings, gold medallions, all reflected the environmental possibilities of this crossroads kingdom. And a deep history of agriculture and food production. Ghana was the hub of an urban civilization based on trade and supported by the ancient traditions of agriculture in West Africa. If you recall your first map quiz, you'll remember that West Africa was one of the original sites of human agriculture in world history, and for thousands of years the domestication of cattle, for example, and the raising of crops provided the West African people with plentiful and nutritional diets that could support growing populations. It's estimated that West African farmers have been working the land with domesticated animals since the 2000s BCE, for example. That is, since the time of the Egyptian pyramids. Supplying, as I say, a rich diet with good food. The majority of the people of West Africa lived in smaller villages and cultivated their own crops, whether it be rice or sorghum or millet, while some communities specialized in other environmental possibilities, herders, for example, of cattle, or along the coasts or the river beaches, fishing. Trade flourished in the towns of the Niger kingdoms, which supported a wide variety of crafts and small manufacturing. Many of the staples of our own diet of North America derive from the transatlantic slave trade over the last 500 years that saw West African people, of course, stolen from their homelands and forced as migrants, you might say, across the Atlantic Oceans, but bringing with them in their minds and in their memories the rich traditions of their homeland. Something like banana, for example, which we're familiar with. Banana is an African crop. The word banana is a Bantu African word. Familiar one-pot stews like jambalaya, for example. Jambalaya is an African or Bantu word, and this tradition of cooking over an open flame, likewise, is an African tradition that we will inherit in the Americas. And it was the development of iron-making technology as well in the era BCE that also enabled these civilizations to develop. As Robert Strayer says, the earliest and most prestigious of these specialized occupations of West Africa was ironsmithing, working with fire and earth, that is iron ore, drawn from the land to produce this highly useful metal. The smiths of the Niger Valley were both feared and revered. It was almost as if they had the power of magicians to create iron. And so, West Africa enters the Iron Age about the same time as the other great civilizations of Eurasia do. And it's thought that perhaps it was an independent development in West Africa, since the techniques to use to forge iron were in many respects rather different than those used in Eurasia. So possibly and independently developing the technology of iron making. Here you see some of the implements and some of the techniques that are still used on a small scale in African villages today to forge the precious metal. All of this inspires a long history, as I say, of connection to Mediterranean cultures, to Europe, and to Eurasia. And this map here shows some of the most heavily traveled trans-Saharan trade routes, the cities like Fez and Marrakesh, and as we saw, Sidi Maza of the northern coastal and northern Sahara regions, connecting as intermediaries through the Berber camel trade and the Arab camel trade to the towns of the Niger River region of West Africa, and from there to the interior forest regions and all the way to the coast, actually, because great communities of people populated all of those regions. One of that cultural commodities, you might say, that is part of the endowment of West African civilization is the spread of Islam to Africa after the 700 CE. From its birthplace in Arabia, Arab merchants and religious teachers will follow the routes of trade ultimately all the way to the Niger River kingdoms, where many of the principal rulers and peoples of those kingdoms of Ghana and Mali and others will convert to Islam, will learn to speak Arabic, and through a process of syncretism develop essentially what is a rather unique version of West African Islam that still thrives in West African countries today, like Nigeria. Creating a new age of cultural exchange and empire. Ghana and Mali and Songhai will be the great imperial names that follow in succession as the premier trading states of West Africa during the Islamic age. You can see here the rough outlines of where these trading kingdoms, these imperial trading kingdoms, formed along the river access, but also along the coastal regions. The Ashanti and Yoruba people developed their own power base as they were often the principal merchants of that highly coveted gold that was mined most famously along these coastal regions here, still called the Gold Coast today, in fact. Timbuktu, back up north here along the Niger River, was a cultural and economic capital by the 1400s, the time of European arrival, for example, but was also a center of Islamic learning and supported two universities that specialized in Islamic teachings with great archives of written works, religious, philosophical, theological works written most often in the language of Islam, Arabic, but in the context of West African learning and culture. And you can still see how the women here of modern day Timbuktu, posing for this photograph more recently, how they're brilliantly patterned and lovely colored textiles, from head wraps to flowering dresses, have been a staple of West African culture for not just hundreds of years, but thousands of years. Some of the great textile artists anywhere globally were found in West Africa. Long before the arrival of Islam, West Africa was a heartland of civilization. This map shows not trade, but language. Each of the colored areas represents a different variation of African languages. There was no single language of Africa. There were four major language families of Africa. When I say language family, I'm referring to something like Indo-European. There were four of these in Africa, and the one that became perhaps the most diverse, the most spoken, and the most geographically dispersed was that called Niger-Congo. And the Niger-Congo language was centered in this area here of Western and West Central Africa. And it was from this great language cluster that the subfamily of Bantu will emerge. Bantu is to Niger-Congo, say, what German or English would be to Indo-European. And like English, Bantu will become a widely traveled and even imperial language as the Bantu people, speaking people. These are dark complected, black complected, Bantu speaking people who reaped the benefits of West African civilization, from its food and farming to its metallurgy, and thus its ability to carry powerful armies with iron weapons, will spread over time across the southern reaches below the equator of the central part of Africa into the southern reaches of the continent, bringing their agriculture, their metallurgy, and implanting it pretty much wherever they went. In some cases, pushing aside other native African peoples. Keep in mind, though, that we tend to want to stereotype African peoples as being of all one color, say black. There are at least four major complexion or color groupings of African people, of which the Bantu-speaking black population is only one. But one reason we associate them almost universally with Africa is that they were so successful as immigrants, as conquerors, as spreaders of their culture. In the same way, for example, the Western Europeans will be, say, in the Americas. No one would ever claim that white-skinned English-speaking people are the ancient native people of California, would they? No, we would say it was white-skinned English-speaking Christian people who migrated fairly recently and through conquest and economic dominance established themselves as a majority population in California. Well, the same would be said then of the Niger-Congo, particularly the Bantu speakers, who in effect settled what were to them foreign regions of Africa over time. And so just as Europe becomes a kind of civilization or heartland of civilizations that will spread to the Western Hemisphere, so too then was West Africa a heartland of civilization that will go a long way toward conquering much of the African continent through a series really of powerful migrations, as you see following the arrows here, beginning as early as 1000 BCE to Equatorial Africa, Eastern Africa, the Great Lakes region of Eastern Africa, you see here, all the way to the very tip of the continent. Linguistic evidence shows that the root Bantu language emerged in what is now Nigeria and Cameroon by 2000 BC. By 1000 BCE, in a series of migrations, Bantu speakers had spread south to the savanna lands of Angola and east to the Lake Victoria region. Over the next 1500 years, they scattered throughout Central and Southern Africa, interacting with and absorbing indigenous populations as they spread. And they took with them their language, their Bantu language, their habits of agriculture, their metallurgy, and much about their culture. Bantu speakers established new kingdoms across southern Africa. The Xhosa people form a branch of the Bantu migrations who live in modern-day South Africa, for example. As farmers and herders, they successfully established themselves in South Africa before the arrival of whites, and some of their people have grown to lead South Africa through conflict of our own time. And I have to note here an interesting culturally syncretic language form. We saw that as well with the spread of Indo-European language groups, and so too here. The familiar X at the beginning of the word Xhosa is actually typically pronounced as if it were a K, but in fact represents a click sound that was native to the native South African people, who were not black, by the way, but who were more of a, I would guess, much like Native American people, almost a reddish brown complexion. The San and the Khoi people, the native people of South Africa, famously spoke the click language, substituting the click sound for their consonants in their spoken language. That this, probably representing the oldest form of human spoken language, merges with the Bantu languages. So the word Xhosa, you almost have to say it from your throat. Xhosa is a melange, is a syncretic blend of the Bantu and the Khoisan click language. And you hear Xhosa speakers today who look like Bantu speakers. They're dark complected people of South Africa, and you can hear, if you listen carefully in their language, you can hear that influence of the native people of South Africa. It was famously Nelson Mandela who, in our own time, freed from his internal exile as a prisoner of the apartheid regime. Nelson Mandela, who came to represent the reunification of peoples of South Africa, including the black skin and colored peoples of South Africa, along with the the descendants of the white colonial Dutch and English peoples of South Africa. It was Mandela's rise to prominence as president of South Africa in the 1990s that once again represented the kind of combining or cultural synthesis, you might say, of the diverse strands of culture that have spread over Africa in history. All right, next we will look then at the tradition of civilization and empire in the Americas as the final lecture in our unit discussion of empires in South Africa, or in world history, excuse